The house had stood longer than the paved road that led to it. A brick and timber relic settled firmly on a plot that had seen 6 generations of one family pass through its doors. It was not just old. It was history embodied, carrying in its bones the stories of a town that had forgotten its roots. Built in the 1870s, the home looked out across rolling fields now dotted with newly built developments, cookie-cutter neighborhoods rising like invasive weeds around the edges of the property. Where once it had stood isolated and proud, it now appeared as a stubborn holdout, a reminder of the past that developers would rather erase. The owner, quiet and content in his inheritance, lived without much concern for the new neighbors who had arrived in droves over the past decade. For him, the house was not an investment or a line on a deed. It was identity, obligation, and sanctuary all at once. Every wall bore the mark of his ancestors. Every floorboard creaked with memories. He paid his property taxes on time, maintained his land with care, and asked nothing of the surrounding community. Yet, trouble has a way of creeping in uninvited, especially when greed and control disguise themselves in the form of modern associations. It began with a letter. Harmless in appearance, it arrived tucked neatly among the ordinary stack of mail. Utilities, a flyer for pizza, the local circular. The envelope bore no familiar mark, no logo recognizable to the owner. Instead, the return address was a generic P.O. box, the kind typically used by organizations that sought distance from accountability. Inside, a sternly worded notice declared that a homeowners association had recently been expanded to cover the area that now included his property. The words dripped with authority, though they were vague on specifics. It demanded a payment of association dues. Late charges already applied, though no previous bills had been sent. The total was insignificant at first glance, just a few $100s, but the tone suggested it was a matter of compliance, not cost. The owner scoffed at the absurdity. He was not part of any HOA. His property predated every subdivision by a century, exempt from their rules, their fees, and their petty governance. He tossed the letter aside, assuming it a clerical error, perhaps even a scam. The house had survived economic depressions, wars, and the rise of suburban sprawl. It would survive this. But what he did not yet know was that this first letter was merely the beginning of a campaign. Weeks later, another envelope appeared, this time bolder, stamped with the word "Final Notice" in red across its face. It claimed the debt had grown, late fees stacking at an alarming rate. The association claimed his property fell within their jurisdiction and accused him of refusing compliance. The words carried a smug arrogance, an assertion of power not yet proven but already enforced. The owner, though irritated, still believed logic would prevail. He filed the letter away, planning to ignore the nonsense until it inevitably dissolved under its own illegitimacy. But the letters did not stop. They multiplied, arriving every week, their language more aggressive, their threats sharper. Soon, they were no longer about unpaid dues but about enforcement actions. The HOA accused him of violations that seemed almost laughable: grass height beyond acceptable standards, paint not conforming to community aesthetics, fencing not approved by the board. Each allegation was a fantasy, dreamed up by an organization that had no legal claim to his home. The house, once a quiet refuge, began to feel like a besieged fortress. Neighbors whispered, some supportive, others wary, afraid of crossing the invisible board that ruled their own lives. A strange sort of pressure grew, as if the HOA's presence extended beyond paper and into the atmosphere. Even walking to the mailbox became an act of defiance, each envelope waiting like a taunt. Then came the notice that turned irritation into alarm. It was not from the HOA directly, but from the county clerk's office. A lien had been filed against his property. The association had gone beyond threats. They had reached into the legal system, attaching debt to a home they had no right to touch. His 150-year-old sanctuary, free from encumbrance for over a century, was now marked as collateral for a fabricated obligation. Shock rippled through him. He had not signed any contract, had never agreed to membership in this HOA. His land predated their existence. Yet, through some manipulative paperwork, they had managed to entangle him in a web designed to strip him of ownership. The lien was not merely a financial nuisance. It was a weapon, a step toward foreclosure if left unchallenged. Anger replaced disbelief. This was no clerical error. It was a calculated move, a strategy to bully, intimidate, and ultimately seize what was not theirs. The association had targeted him precisely because his house stood alone, outside the rows of compliant residents. If they could force him into submission, they could extend their control, perhaps even claim the land outright. The old house, with its creaking floors and stubborn brick, had become a prize for opportunists who saw only value in property lines, not in history. And as the lien settled over the deed like a shadow, the battle lines were drawn. The owner would not surrender. The HOA had chosen the wrong house to haunt, the wrong man to bully, and the wrong legacy to challenge, for now he stood quietly within the walls his family had built, looking at the stack of threatening letters piled high on the table. He felt the weight of history pressing against his back, urging him to fight, reminding him that this home had endured for generations against greater storms than this. The war was only beginning, and with the lien officially recorded, the HOA had made their opening move. The next chapter would not be about ignoring letters. It would be about fighting back. The filing of the lien changed everything. What had once been an annoyance of letters and empty threats now became a looming legal battle, one with stakes as high as losing the home entirely. The old house no longer felt untouchable. It had been marked, targeted, and documented in county records as a property under dispute. This was no longer just harassment. It was a scheme in motion. The owner spent long nights in the study surrounded by stacks of papers. Old deeds, land surveys, and records dating back more than a century lay scattered across the desk. Each document bore proof of what he already knew. The house had always stood outside the governance of any neighborhood association. The land was established long before the concept of modern HOAs even existed. He traced his grandfather's signature on the oldest deed, felt the weight of history in every line, and wondered how it could all be so easily ignored by a group of strangers with clipboards and bylaws. He began researching the association that claimed authority over him. It had been created only 10 years earlier, coinciding with the development of the subdivision that now sprawled across farmland once neighboring his property. Its charter mentioned specific lots, all part of that subdivision, and nowhere did it include his historic parcel. Yet, in more recent amendments filed quietly in county offices, vague language had been added about, expanding jurisdiction to adjoining properties within defined perimeters. This bureaucratic sleight of hand allowed them to argue, falsely, that his land fell under their reach. The deeper he dug, the clearer the picture became. The HOA was run by a small board of individuals, most of them recent arrivals to the area, who wielded their positions less like stewards of community and more like petty monarchs. They had written themselves power to fine, to enforce, and even to foreclose. It was an empire built on fear and compliance. For most homeowners in the subdivision, fighting back was unthinkable. But he was not one of them. He had never signed their contracts, never agreed to their rules, and certainly never given them permission to attach debts to his home. Still, the lien remained. The county clerk confirmed its existence but offered no guidance. To the system, it was a legitimate filing until proven otherwise. That was the cruel reality. The burden was not on the HOA to prove their authority, but on him to disprove it. The injustice of it all ignited something fierce inside him. He refused to be another quiet casualty of bureaucratic bullying. The first step was hiring an attorney. He met with several, many of whom were hesitant to take on an HOA. These organizations were infamous for being aggressive in court, dragging out cases, and bleeding homeowners dry through legal costs. But eventually he found one willing to fight, an older lawyer, seasoned in property law, who shared his disdain for the overreach of associations. The lawyer examined the deed, the history, and the HOA's paperwork, and agreed. The case was strong. Yet strong cases still required time, money, and patience. While legal filings were prepared, the HOA did not wait. They escalated. Letters shifted from final notices to demands for immediate payment. Threats of foreclosure appeared in bold print. Neighbors began to notice unfamiliar cars parked near his property, vehicles idling just long enough to be unsettling. It became clear this was not only about money but about intimidation. The board wanted to break him before the case could reach a judge, and it worked its way into daily life. Trips to town carried whispers from locals who had heard rumors. Some believed he owed money, others thought he had neglected his duties as a member. The HOA was spinning its narrative, painting him as a defiant outsider refusing to play by the rules everyone else followed. Lies spread faster than truth, and soon he found himself isolated from people he had known for years. One evening, while walking the perimeter of his land, he noticed survey stakes driven into the ground near the edge of his property line. Freshly placed, brightly colored, and ominous. He had not ordered a survey, nor had the county. These were the HOA's doing, a physical manifestation of their encroachment. They were attempting to redraw boundaries, to stake their claim in the soil itself. He ripped the stakes out and tossed them aside. But the message was clear. They were preparing for a larger fight. The lawyer advised documenting everything, every letter, every stake, every idle car near the driveway. The case would rely not only on historical evidence but on proving harassment and malicious intent. The owner kept a meticulous record, a journal of events paired with photographs and copies of every notice. The pile of evidence grew thicker by the day, a testament to both the absurdity of the situation and the relentlessness of his opponents. Despite the weight of it all, the house gave him strength. Its walls stood as a reminder that he was more than just one man against an association. He was the caretaker of a legacy that had endured for a century and a half. The thought of losing it, not to disaster, not to neglect, but to the greed of a manufactured authority, was unbearable. And yet he knew the fight was only escalating. The HOA was not backing down. In their eyes, his resistance was a challenge to their power, a threat to their control over the neighborhood. If he succeeded in proving they had no claim over him, others might begin questioning their authority too. For the board, this was about more than his house. It was about maintaining fear as the foundation of their rule. The legal case would soon be filed, but even that would take months to see a courtroom. In the meantime, the HOA would not stop. They had already crossed into harassment, already manipulated the legal system to place a lien on a property that never belonged to them. What would they do next? The owner lay awake at night, listening to the creaks of the old house, wondering if at any moment he might wake to find strangers on his land, enforcing rules that never applied to him. The sense of siege grew heavier with each passing day. He was ready to fight, but he also understood the reality. The association would do everything in its power to grind him down before the fight ever began. The lien was just the opening shot. The real battle was still ahead, and as he prepared for it, he could feel the weight of generations behind him, urging him not to yield. The HOA had underestimated both the man and the house. The storm was only beginning. The storm arrived not with thunder or rain, but with paper. Certified letters, hand-delivered notices, and envelopes stamped with warnings began to flood in. Each one grew more hostile, more brazen, more determined to break him down. The HOA board was relentless, its machinery of intimidation grinding on without pause. Where most people would have buckled under the weight of constant threats, he only grew sharper in his resolve. Still, resolve did not shield him from exhaustion. Every morning, the mailbox became a gauntlet. Neighbors, conditioned by their own fear of the HOA, looked on with curiosity and pity as he gathered the latest barrage of demands. They whispered among themselves, speculating on why he resisted, wondering if perhaps he had brought this upon himself. The board's propaganda spread quickly, framing him as a defiant outlier who endangered community harmony. The truth, that he was never part of their community to begin with, was carefully omitted. The old house, though silent, bore witness to it all. The walls seemed to carry the tension, the heavy air of siege that grew thicker each day. Once a sanctuary, it had become a fortress, every creak of the floorboards echoing like the footsteps of enemies approaching. Late at night, headlights sometimes swept across the windows, cars lingering at the edge of the property as if marking their territory. He would stand at the window, unflinching, watching the silhouettes of vehicles retreat back into the subdivision. Their presence was a message. We are watching you. Meanwhile, the legal process began its slow march. His lawyer filed motions to challenge the lien, presenting the historical deeds as proof of independence from the HOA. Copies of century-old documents were sent to court, each one a line of defense against the fabricated claims. But justice moved at a pace far slower than harassment. The court date was set months away, leaving him exposed to the HOA's daily assaults in the meantime. Then came the fines. The association began issuing violations at an alarming rate. They accused him of failing to maintain his lawn, despite photographic evidence showing it neatly trimmed. They cited him for unapproved exterior modifications, pointing to the antique shutters that had been on the house for decades. Even the fence, weathered but sturdy, was declared non-compliant. Each violation carried a fee, and each fee was stacked onto the growing ledger of debt the HOA claimed he owed. By their accounting, the total now reached thousands. The lien had started as a trickle. Now the HOA was engineering a flood. If left unchecked, the debt would balloon until foreclosure became not just a threat, but a certainty. It was a playbook they had used before on others, he learned. Neighbors who had lost their homes after years of manufactured debts piled beyond repayment. But unlike those neighbors, his home carried more than financial value. It carried history, legacy, and defiance. The owner refused to pay a cent. Instead, he documented every false claim, storing them in binders labeled meticulously by date. Photographs of his yard, his shutters, his fence, each one evidence of the HOA's fraudulent campaign. He understood that survival depended on not just resistance, but preparation. Still, the pressure was immense. Friends who once visited now stayed away, fearful of association with him. The HOA had turned his fight into a stigma. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings no longer arrived. Even the local businesses he frequented looked at him differently, as though the whispers had poisoned his reputation. It was isolation by design, a tactic as cruel as it was effective. One morning, he found a notice taped directly to his front door. It bore no envelope, no courtesy of mailing. The words were blunt. Foreclosure proceedings initiated. His heart sank, not from surprise, but from the audacity of it. The HOA had escalated again, skipping steps, jumping ahead in their threats as though they already held victory in their hands. He knew it was a bluff, legally unenforceable at this stage, but the sight of it plastered on the door of his ancestral home lit a fire in him. This was no longer just about protecting his property. It was about exposing a system built to prey on the vulnerable. The HOA thrived on fear and silence, but he refused to give them either. He began reaching out to reporters, to advocacy groups, to online communities dedicated to fighting HOA abuse. What he discovered shocked him. His story was not unique. Across the country, countless homeowners had faced similar battles, many of them losing everything to the same manufactured debts and fraudulent liens. His fight was not just his own. It was part of a larger war against unchecked power. But the HOA noticed his outreach. Almost immediately, retaliation followed. Mysterious complaints were filed against him with the county, alleging unsafe conditions on his property. Inspectors appeared without warning, searching for violations that did not exist. Anonymous tips were made to local authorities, suggesting illegal activity on the land. Though nothing came of these baseless claims, the harassment was clear. The HOA wanted him silenced. The old house, though battered by time, stood firm. Its presence reminded him that endurance was possible. Every brick laid by his ancestors was now part of the fight, a testament to survival against forces larger and crueler than any one family. He began to see the house not as a burden, but as an ally, a symbol too powerful for the HOA to erase easily. Still, nights grew darker. He slept lightly, the sound of every passing car pulling him from restless dreams. He double-checked locks, patrolled the property with a flashlight, and wondered if the next escalation would move from paper threats to physical confrontation. The siege had reached a boiling point. The upcoming court date loomed on the horizon, the one chance to bring truth into the open and force the HOA to defend its fabricated claims. But until then, the board had free rein to continue their pressure campaign. Each day was a battle for sanity, each night a test of courage, and yet, in the midst of it all, a strange certainty settled over him. The HOA had overreached. Their arrogance had led them to believe he was just another homeowner they could crush. But they had underestimated the resolve of a man with nothing to lose and everything to protect. The war was far from over. The lien was still in place, the fines still growing, the threats still arriving. But the tide was shifting. His fight was no longer in the shadows. It was gaining attention. And as the court date crept closer, the HOA would soon face the one thing it feared most: exposure. The battle lines were drawn deeper than ever. The next chapter would not just be about survival. It would be about turning the fight back on them. The court date arrived with the weight of inevitability. Months of waiting, documenting, and enduring harassment had all led to this moment. The morning air felt heavy as he dressed in quiet determination, carrying binders of evidence that represented not just his defense, but the legacy of a home that had stood for 150 years. Outside, the old house seemed to watch him leave, its windows reflecting the pale light of dawn as though reminding him that it, too, depended on his resolve. The courthouse was filled with the sterile scent of bureaucracy, its walls lined with cold marble and the echoes of countless disputes before his own. Yet his case carried a significance that felt larger than the room itself. On one side sat the Homeowners Association, represented by sharp-suited lawyers funded by the dues of compliant neighbors. On the other side, he and his seasoned attorney, armed not with deep pockets but with truth buried in old deeds and dusty county records. The HOA's strategy became clear within minutes. Their lawyers spoke with confidence, painting him as a delinquent homeowner, an obstinate man refusing to comply with the rules agreed upon by the community. They presented their inflated ledger of fines, their accusations of non-compliance, their photographs taken from odd angles meant to exaggerate imperfections. To the untrained eye, it might have appeared damning, but when his attorney rose, the tone shifted. Calmly, methodically, he unveiled the history. The original deed from the 1870s, predating the HOA by more than a century. The subdivision map showing the boundaries of the association, clearly excluding his parcel. The amended language, vague and manipulative, inserted decades later without the consent of property owners outside the subdivision. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the HOA's authority, revealing the truth. They had no claim over the house, no jurisdiction over the land, no right to impose dues or fines. The courtroom grew tense as the contradictions piled up. The HOA's lawyers attempted to argue jurisdiction, leaning on the ambiguous wording of their amendments. But ambiguity is not law. Their foundation, once presented as firm, now appeared cracked and hollow. The judge listened intently, asking pointed questions that left the HOA's representatives fumbling for answers. For the first time in months, the owner felt the pressure lift. His evidence was not just strong, it was undeniable. The house's history stood as a shield, one that no manufactured paperwork could pierce. Still, he knew better than to celebrate. Court battles were rarely decided in a single day. Motions, delays, and appeals could stretch this fight far beyond the hearing. Yet in that moment, as his attorney laid out the undeniable truth, he felt something he had not felt in a long time: hope. But the HOA was not finished. Outside the courtroom, their representatives whispered, exchanged glances, and planned their next move. They were not merely concerned with the legal outcome. They were concerned with perception. If word spread that the association had overreached, that their authority could be challenged, it could unravel their entire grip over the subdivision. Other homeowners might begin questioning fines, resisting dues, even fighting back. For the board, this case was not about one house. It was about control. The harassment did not stop after the hearing. In fact, it intensified. Notices still arrived. some now bearing an even more aggressive tone, as though mocking the court's consideration of the evidence. The lien, while under legal challenge, still appeared in county records, a constant reminder of the association's reach. Anonymous cars continued to idle near his property, and once again survey stakes appeared along the edge of his land. This time they were driven deeper, more numerous, almost like an army preparing for invasion. Neighbors grew bolder in their avoidance. Some crossed the street rather than greet him. Others whispered loudly enough for him to hear, repeating the HOA's narrative of him being a troublemaker, a man who refused to follow the rules. Lies spread like vines, choking the truth in a web of rumor. He understood now that the HOA's greatest weapon was not just legal manipulation, but social isolation. By turning the community against him, they hoped to weaken his spirit, but instead it hardened him. If the board thought intimidation would break him, they had underestimated the resolve of a man standing not just for himself, but for generations before him. The house had withstood wars, depressions, and disasters. It would not fall to paperwork and petty tyrants. Behind the scenes, his attorney uncovered more. Financial records of the HOA revealed mismanagement of funds, lavish expenditures by board members, and questionable contracts awarded to companies with ties to those same board members. It painted a picture not of a community organization, but of a small empire of corruption, feeding on the enforced compliance of fearful residents. Exposing this would not just clear his name. It would dismantle the board's illusion of authority. The next hearing was scheduled, and with it came the promise of presenting not only his defense, but evidence of the HOA's misconduct. The board, sensing the threat, redoubled their efforts. They sent letters warning of escalating foreclosure proceedings, despite knowing the legal process was stalled. They sent inspectors who once again claimed violations on his property, each one laughably false. And then, one night, he returned home to find something chilling. Graffiti scrawled across the side of his barn. The words were simple but venomous. Pay or leave. It was no longer just about paperwork. The HOA, or someone loyal to them, had crossed into direct intimidation. The message was clear. They wanted him gone, one way or another. But instead of fear, it ignited fury. He photographed the damage, added it to his growing binder of evidence, and vowed that the next hearing would not just be about saving his house, it would be about exposing everything the HOA had tried to bury. The fight was escalating beyond anything he could have imagined. The board had chosen him as their example, but in doing so, they had created their own undoing. He would not stop. He could not stop. Too much was at stake now. As the next court date loomed closer, he stood in front of the old house, running his hand along the weathered brick, feeling the weight of history beneath his fingertips. The house seemed to whisper its silent encouragement. It had stood for 150 years. With his fight, it would stand for 150 more. The HOA believed they had power, but power built on lies and intimidation cannot endure forever. The next chapter of this war would not just be about defense. It would be about turning the spotlight directly on them, and once exposed, their empire of control might crumble faster than they ever imagined. The weeks leading to the next hearing carried the weight of inevitability. What had begun as letters and threats had grown into a war of endurance. The owner knew the board would not relent, not while their grip on the neighborhood hung in the balance. But the coming session in court would no longer be about defending his house alone. It would be about peeling back the layers of corruption that had shielded the HOA from scrutiny for years. The evidence was ready. His attorney had built a case not only to prove that the HOA had no jurisdiction over his property, but also to expose their financial misconduct. Binders were filled with spreadsheets, copies of contracts, and board meeting minutes that hinted at embezzlement and self-dealing. Thousands of dollars in maintenance fees had been funneled into questionable projects, landscaping contracts awarded to relatives of board members, inflated invoices from companies with no real track record, and even expense accounts used for meals and entertainment disguised as community development. The morning of the hearing, tension ran high. The courtroom felt smaller this time, as if the stakes had pulled the walls closer together. The HOA arrived in force. Board members in their best clothes, lawyers carrying thick folders, and even a handful of residents who had been persuaded to attend as silent witnesses of their authority. Their presence was meant to intimidate, to remind him that he was one man standing against a machine. But the machine rattled when truth seeped into its gears. The attorney began with the property's history once again, reiterating the undeniable fact that the house predated the HOA by more than a century. The board's amendments, vague and sweeping, held no power over land never incorporated into the subdivision. The judge nodded, already familiar with this argument from the previous hearing. But the real shift came when the financial evidence was introduced. The room grew still as spreadsheets were projected, showing a trail of money siphoned from residents' dues into the pockets of board-connected companies. Lavish community retreats billed as necessary leadership workshops. Payments to contractors who shared last names with board members. Line items so brazen in their dishonesty that even the HOA's lawyers struggled to spin them as legitimate. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their confidence cracked under the scrutiny. For years, they had operated unchecked, shielded by the fear of their residents. But in this courtroom, fear held no sway. Facts did. The owner sat quietly, watching the tide turn. For months, he had been the target of harassment, treated as a defiant outlier. Now the narrative was shifting. He was no longer just the man refusing to pay dues. He was the whistleblower pulling back the curtain on corruption. The judge ordered a review of the HOA's financial records, a devastating blow to the board. What had begun as their attempt to seize a single property now threatened to unravel their entire empire. The lien against his house was declared provisionally unenforceable, pending further review. Though not yet erased, it was the first real crack in the wall the HOA had built around him. But victory in court did not end the war. Outside the courthouse, the board's representatives seethed with quiet rage. They had lost control of the narrative, and worse, they had been exposed. For them, this was no longer just about money. It was about survival. If residents learned the full extent of the corruption, the board's reign would collapse. Retaliation followed swiftly. Within days, more inspectors appeared at his property, citing him for unsafe conditions and demanding immediate repairs. A complaint was filed with the zoning board, claiming his house violated setback requirements, a laughable claim for a structure that had stood unmoved for 150 years. The harassment was so transparent it bordered on desperate. Each move was another attempt to bury him in paperwork, to wear him down before the next hearing could strip away their power entirely. Yet something had shifted in the neighborhood. Whispers began to spread, not just about him, but about the board. Residents who once avoided him now approached cautiously, asking quiet questions about what had been revealed in court. Some had long suspected mismanagement but had been too afraid to speak. Now, with the board's integrity under public scrutiny, cracks appeared in their once solid wall of silence. He welcomed these moments, though carefully. Trust was fragile in a community where fear had reigned for so long. Still, he could see the tide shifting. The HOA's greatest weapon, intimidation, was beginning to lose its edge, but the board grew more reckless. Late one night, he returned home to find tire tracks cutting across his field, leading dangerously close to the barn. Whoever had driven through had done so intentionally, tearing deep ruts into the soil. It was vandalism, plain and simple, but also a message. We can reach you anywhere. He documented it like everything else, adding photographs to his growing collection of evidence. The binder now felt less like a defense and more like a weapon of its own. Through it all, the old house remained unyielding. Its walls absorbed the stress, its roof sheltered him from the storm. Each day, he drew strength from its endurance. The HOA could file liens, spread lies, and send threats, but they could not erase 150 years of history with a stamp of paperwork. The house was not just real estate. It was defiance, brick and mortar proof that not everything could be consumed by the sprawl of subdivisions and the greed of board members. As the next court date approached, tension grew in the subdivision. Residents whispered of recalls, of elections, of change. The board clung desperately to its remaining power, holding closed-door meetings and sending newsletters filled with half-truths and carefully worded denials. But denial could not erase financial records, and lies could not withstand the truth forever. The owner knew the battle was nearing its climax. The lien still hung over his property, but its foundation was crumbling. The HOA was exposed, its corruption laid bare, and its desperation growing more dangerous with every passing day. The fight was no longer about whether he would lose his house. It was about whether the board could survive the truth. And as he prepared his evidence for the final hearing, he understood something profound. This was no longer just his story. It was the story of every homeowner who had ever been bullied, intimidated, or robbed by the false authority of an HOA. His fight was theirs too. The end game was coming. The board had overplayed its hand, and the house stood stronger than ever. The next chapter would decide everything. The final hearing arrived with a charged tension that seemed to reverberate through the walls of the courthouse. For months, the battle had been fought on paper, in courtrooms, and in whispered conversations across the neighborhood. Now, everything would come to a head. The lien that had once threatened to steal a 150-year-old house hung precariously, the symbol of the HOA's audacity. But it would not stand. As the proceedings began, the owner and his attorney presented their evidence with precision. Every document, every photograph, every historical deed was laid before the judge. The story of the house was more than a timeline of ownership. It was a testament to endurance, to legacy, and to the injustice of modern overreach. The HOA's lawyers attempted to counter, but their arguments were weak, relying on vague language and technicalities that could not withstand scrutiny. The court listened to the financial evidence last. The spreadsheets, contracts, and invoices exposed the board's self-serving practices, inflated charges, payments to connected companies, and misuse of resident dues. The room was silent as the judge reviewed the documents, each line item an undeniable proof of corruption and mismanagement. The HOA's once confident representatives sat rigid, their composure cracking under the weight of truth. As the hearing continued, the judge made it clear. The lien filed against the house was invalid. The board had no legal claim over the property, and all fines, past and present, were void. The HOA's attempts to intimidate the owner, from letters to trespassing inspectors and even vandalism, had only strengthened his case. The judge admonished the board for overreach and warned that further harassment could result in sanctions. The courtroom held its collective breath as the ruling was delivered. The house was safe, its ownership unquestioned, and the HOA's authority over it non-existent. The sense of relief was immediate but tempered by the knowledge that reputations could not be restored overnight. Across the neighborhood, residents began to speak in hushed tones. The HOA's credibility, once untouchable, was shattered. People who had once turned their backs now saw the truth. The board had lied, manipulated, and bullied a homeowner who had never been a member. The exposure of their corruption sent ripples through the subdivision, igniting discussions of reform and recalls. The owner returned home that evening to find the old house standing proud against the setting sun, its silhouette a monument to endurance. The lien had been lifted, the threats nullified, and the intimidation defeated. The battle had been won, not just with legal skill, but with unwavering persistence and a refusal to surrender to fear. Yet the victory was deeper than the legal outcome. Across the town, whispers spread about the audacity of an HOA that had tried to claim a property it had no right to touch. Other residents, emboldened by the example, began questioning their own board's practices. Meetings that once carried the aura of inevitability now became arenas of scrutiny. The HOA that had thought it untouchable was now a cautionary tale. Its influence diminished. The owner took a slow walk through his property, touching the weathered brick and the creaking floorboards. Each wall seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The house, more than any words or legal documents, had been his shield. Its endurance, rooted in history and memory, had outlasted the board's temporary authority. It had survived neglect, modernization pressures, and now, corporate-style intimidation. Its presence was a reminder that some things cannot be dictated by bylaws or coerced by threats. Even neighbors who had once doubted him now approached with cautious respect, offering apologies or support. The social isolation imposed by the HOA had weakened as its power crumbled. Where fear had ruled, clarity now reigned. Residents began to speak more freely about reforming the association, about ensuring that such abuse could never happen again. The house, in standing firm, had shifted the balance of power not just for itself, but for an entire community. The owner knew the fight had left scars. Months of harassment, vandalism, and intimidation could not be undone. But those scars were proof of resilience. He had faced the full machinery of modern bureaucratic oppression and emerged victorious. And the house, with its 150-year-old bones, had carried him through it all. Even as the neighborhood began to breathe easier, he remained vigilant. History had taught him that complacency invites overreach. But now, with the lien lifted and the HOA's overreach exposed, he could live with the certainty that his home was his own. It was a sanctuary no one could claim, a testament to resistance, and a beacon for others who might face similar battles. In the weeks that followed, reforms were discussed within the HOA. Board members who had abused their power were replaced, and policies were implemented to prevent the recurrence of such overreach. The story of the house spread beyond the neighborhood, shared in local papers, online forums, and advocacy groups. It became a symbol. One person's courage can challenge systems designed to intimidate, and a commitment to history and truth can prevail against greed and manipulation. The owner stood once again at the front of the property, looking over the land that had been the heart of so many battles. The house, unyielding and steadfast, had proven that legacy cannot be stolen. He had defended not just his home, but the principle that history, integrity, and truth hold power that no association can erase. The HOA had tried to claim a home that was never theirs, to manipulate a system that favored fear over justice. But the house and its guardian had withstood the storm, and in doing so, they had reminded everyone who heard the story. Authority unearned is fragile, and the courage to stand firm can topple even the most entrenched power. The battle was over. The house stood intact, the lien removed, and the community awakened to the importance of vigilance. History once again had prevailed, and as the sun set behind the 150-year-old home, its silhouette cast long shadows across the land, a reminder that legacy cannot be bought, threatened, or stolen. It can only be defended. Victory had come not through compromise, but through courage, patience, and unyielding belief in what was right. And the house, weathered but unbroken, would continue to tell its story for generations to come. The HOA had learned a harsh lesson. You cannot bully history, and you cannot intimidate those who refuse to bow. The battle was won. The home was safe, and the story of defiance would echo long after the ink on the court documents had dried.